Greetings, gardeners. She's a drizzly morning here, and I had to stop my transplanting. So, I wanted to talk about growing trees and other fruits from seeds. I get a lot of feedback one way or the other from people about, whether a fruit tree should ever be grown from a seed, whether we should always use grafted name cultivars, or this or that. And so I thought I wanted to talk a little bit about this today because I believe that there are two sides to this coin and they're both correct. Okay. So just to confirm the fact that I have many grafted and named varieties of fruit trees growing around here. Obviously almost all of my apple trees, for instance, in Hawaii are all named cultivars that were grafted by Ellie Cook over there in California because I was seeking special low-chill varieties that might work here. And so far, I have found that Dorset Golden from the Bahamas is successful. On the other hand, I have a seedling grown Ein Shemer it's from Israel, the Ein Shemer, and it's also a very, very low chill apple. Now, I took a shot planting some seeds. If I don't like what comes on it, I'll cut it back and I'll graft Dorset Golden or something else on top of it. But to explain how it is that I originally got involved with growing trees from seeds, it's pretty simple. Like a lot of folks, my initial gardening projects started out by planting vegetable seeds. It's really flower vegetable seeds is where most of us actually begin. Some of us begin growing cannabis, who knows, but generally we're working with annual type plants when we begin doing this. And then we gradually expand, into perennials and woody shrubs and things. Maybe we do, I did. And so from the original vegetables, what got me started in growing trees wasn't fruit trees. In the Midwest, I began growing forest trees. Quite a bit of land. A lot of it was poor pasture and things like this that just weren't worth keeping in open fields, and so we began to plant tree crops. Well, one of the ways I could get certain trees more easily was to collect seeds and grow my own. So we'd grow maple trees, for instance. I'd grow oaks. I'd grow various types of pine trees and things like this. A friend of mine in central Wisconsin was a retired vegetable farmer. He used to love to plant Eastern American black walnut from seeds. And so black walnut, in the native range, it really isn't a whole lot further than, say, Madison, Wisconsin. Well, he was, 100 miles beyond that in the state. But there were some local black walnut trees that had been planted on farms over the years. Who knows the origin of them? But he would gather the nuts from those trees and then plant them on his property. Well, I took after him, and I was living again, 150 miles in the state north of where he lived. And so the black walnut was even less likely to grow well in that area. But there were, again, local trees that had been planted by people years before, and some had survived and were fruiting. And the thing about walnuts is that wherever you find the walnut, ordinarily, if you take a seed that's growing in Maine on a butternut or a black walnut, that seed is going to fruit within the climate of that area. Let's say it's a 120-day growing season. Okay. Well, butternuts or walnuts taken from Maine out of a 120-day growing season, if you move them to Arkansas and plant the seed, you're going to get trees that will produce in the 120 days. On the other hand, walnuts from Arkansas in the Ozarks can take 180 to 200 days a year to ripen a seed. And so if you take nuts from Arkansas and move them to Maine, they will never fruit. It's kind of like that. Plus, as people brought nuts north, like the Native Americans, for instance, used to move pecans and pawpaws just about anywhere they went as they moved up and down, following game and gathering whatever it was they were looking for. On their favorite campsites, they used to bring pecan seed and they'd bring pawpaw seed and they'd plant this stuff. Well, a pecan was really native to Illinois, but they spread the pecan south as they went. They also spread the pecan as far north as La Crosse, Wisconsin, by planting seeds. Chances are a lot of the original planting of the trees didn't survive, but some of them did. So then as those trees made seeds, they'd gather from those nuts and move them even further. And so the idea of gathering seeds in a local environment can have tremendous advantages over, say, buying a group of seedlings that somebody grew. If the group of seedlings, like I say, was a walnut that came out of Missouri, and I'm trying to plant it in central Wisconsin, not going to work. Not really. Most of them won't. So that's really how I got involved in growing trees from seed. Eventually, I moved from forest trees, and I started growing apple trees from seed. Now, what I've learned about growing fruit trees from seed is that most of what you hear from people is that the trees will not produce true to type from a seed. And when it comes to fruit trees like an apple, like a peach, like a pear, like a cherry, all of these temperate climate fruits that have been with humans for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years as crops. Apples go back thousands of years with humans. These plants have been selected and crossed and hybridized and selected and moved around and so on and so forth. Okay, to such an extent at this point that their genetics are so mixed up that when you plant a seed, most of the progeny will not produce anything that looks like the parent, and oftentimes will not produce anything that's worth a hoot either. They produce a lot of gnarly, bitter, small crabapple type fruits. It's very, very common when apple seed is planted. Now, I don't have a lot of experience in planting, say, peaches from seed or other things like this. Most of my temperate fruit experience was with the apple. Now, the reason why that is because where I lived in northern Wisconsin, apple trees really didn't grow very well. There were only a handful of varieties that were actually hardy enough to put up with that local climate. The trees had to be able to take 40 degrees below zero in order to survive, and there were a few types that would. The Cortland, for instance, does. But I wanted better. So I was curious what would happen if we took seeds from apple trees that were known to grow in the northern part of Wisconsin and in the northern part of Minnesota, and plant the seeds out. And I did that. Now, what I found was that probably over 80% of the progeny wasn't good for anything except for smoking salmon. You know, the trees were of low-grade fruit, but applewood, of course, is premium when you're doing a barbecue. So I got a low-grade tree, no loss. Cut it down, smoke salmon with it. But a small percentage of the trees would yield fruit that was in some cases better than the parent tree. That can happen. It takes quite a few individuals to find that, but the beauty of it is that since the progeny came from trees that were growing in the area, they were already fairly well adapted in their genetics to the extreme winters, and oftentimes the progeny would also put up with the weather that we had there. And I did end up with one apple tree that was not only hardy enough, but bore beautiful large apples. They were green on one side, red blush on the other. The seed actually came out of a group of Spartan, which is an offshoot of Macintosh. And Macintosh originated in Ontario. And so this was all, good direction to work with. This apple, in my opinion, was not as pretty as a Spartan because it had the green on one side. But the taste, all of my friends, when they'd come up the driveway and they'd see there was fruit in that tree, they would usually ask, but the first thing they wanted to do was start to pick some of it because the fruit was so incredibly good. So here we have a case where, yes, you can even get a very desirable fruit from an apple tree seed, but that's kind of an unusual occurrence. As I ended up in California eventually, there is an awful lot of potential subtropical fruits that might grow that are not heavily utilized, nor are they readily available in the marketplace as a potted tree. And so I began planting seeds from guavas. I began planting seeds from white sapote. I began planting seeds from macadamia nuts, etc., jaboticabas, and many different things that we messed around with there. And it turned out that a lot of the trees would grow in the California environment. It just wasn't really that well known that they could grow in that area. Well, for one, because it was hard for me to find the potted trees, seed became a way to do it. Again, same situation. I'd go to trees that I knew of in that area, and I'd gather seeds from them. I'd plant those seeds, and that kind of ensured that I was going to get the hardiness that I needed out of the seedlings. Now, what I discovered was that in subtropical fruits and later in tropical fruits, that the genetic variability of these trees is much, much lower than our temperate climate fruits. An apple, which had been cultivated for thousands of years, the genetics are so tumbled that it's a total crapshoot when you plant that seed. But you take seed from Casamaroa edulis, the white sapote, and plant that seed. So far, to my experience, everything that comes from that seed is going to produce trees that are at least similar to the parent tree. I never got a tree that produced fruit that could not be used. It wasn't uncommon that sometimes fruit size would vary, but occasionally fruits would become larger or fruits would become smaller a little bit, but typically they tended to hold quality pretty well. Well, since it was an experiment, I didn't really know whether a lot of these plants were going to grow for me or not. Well, so, does it make sense for me to search, for years on end, trying to find a grafted Subel sapote, 30 years ago in Northern California? No, not really. It was very difficult to find that tree. Hardly available in any nurseries at those times. Now, today, it's a little more common. There's this movement towards growing exotic fruits, and so it's easier to find them. But 30 years ago, it was not easy in Northern California to find most of the stuff I wanted to grow. So by using the seeds, I was able to grow large amounts of the plants. And that made a lot of difference because, I had chirimoyas, for instance, that I was growing from seeds. They came from several different sources. One of the sources actually was high elevation Mexico in Oaxaca. In 89-90, we had a great freeze that came through. They call that a 100-year freeze episode. And yeah, it wiped out so much stuff. I mean, even froze lemon trees halfway to the ground, which were commonly grown in that area. It was cold, and it was cold for weeks. The soil behind buildings in the shade froze solid. You could ice skate on sidewalks where sprinkler water came for a couple hours every morning. It was really cold. And so much of the borderline subtropical stuff either got severely damaged or was killed outright. Well, I had 20 chirimoya trees going at that point. During that snap, 18 of the trees died due to cold. But they were all in one block together in my nursery. 2 trees survived. Those 2 trees were from high elevation Oaxaca. And so I was about to throw in the towel on chirimoyas and move on to pawpaws and say the heck with it, but the 2 trees went through another freeze in 90-91. They still survived it. That killed my key limes, for instance. And so I said, all right, guys, we'll go with you. And they did finally eventually begin to bear fruit and blah, blah, etc., etc. By having large groups of these plants from seed, when the weather turns, Stuff that isn't hardy enough is just plain gonna die. It's the canary in the coal mine. You have your acid test right there. Whatever survives that weather is most likely going to grow and is a place where you can get a stronger genetic pool to be able to work from. This has been my experience. But the tropical and the subtropical fruits have not been fiddled with as much genetically. A lot of cases, some of these things are literally pulled right from the forest, right out of the wild, and they grow just like the forest trees I used to grow in the Midwest. A lot of them are so true to type, it is not funny, okay? The abiu, for instance, an example, all of my abiu trees here on this farm are seedling grown. I have 3 that I have here that produce. Now, 2 of them produce very early. 1 is very slow and late to produce, okay? But one of the trees out of 3, it's not bad averages, has fruit on it that is as large or larger than almost all the grafted commercial varieties I have ever seen. Also, the quality of that fruit is exceptional, rather low in latex, very high in sugar. And so here's a case where out of 3 trees put in the field, 2 of them have acceptable quality fruit. 1 of them has fruit that's better than most you'll ever run across. And so with tropical trees, this sort of situation can occur. You cannot make the comparison between our temperate climate fruits and tropical fruits when you're talking about growing from seed. To begin with, we're here, 2,500 miles away from any piece of land. We're right out in the middle of the ocean. We do have a pretty good collection in private hands of exotic fruit trees here on this island. Unless you know where it is, it can be really hard to find it because they say it's private hands. There are a few commercial fruit tree growers here on this island. Most notably, we have a single, at least on this side of the island, that does a lot of grafting of citrus, avocados, mangoes, blah, 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 such and such. And I have a lot of their grafted trees in my field. I'm passionate about tangerines, tangors, and tangelos. And so I have a huge collection of them here. All of them grafted, all of them purchased initially since I've begun propagating my own by grafting more of them onto rootstock. So they were originally brought in that way. But trees like abiu, I have yet myself to actually run across in a marketplace a grafted abiu tree anywhere on this island. I haven't found one. Okay. Well, so am I going to sit around and wait for a grafted cultivar, or am I going to try to ship one from Florida or something at extreme expense? No, I don't think so. I just take a handful of seeds I plant and I see what comes from it. Seeds in Hawaii become a very, very good way to work with these trees because, sometimes I'll run across just a handful of fruits that I was able to get from a certain tree that somebody has. As I ran a nursery in California, people used to come to me all the time and go, I want Bing cherries. I want Bing cherries. Okay, yeah, fine. All right, that's fine. We got Bing cherries. They're easy to get. Although there isn't any such thing as Bing per se. There's a whole cluster of similar type cherries. But, prior to 1959, America's cherry wasn't Bing. America's cherry was Black Tartarian. And Black Tartarian is a superior fruit. It's a better cherry than Bing. Bing's okay. But the reason they went to Bing is that Bing, you can take that and bounce it off a wall. It'll come back and catch it, and you can put it in the basket and sell it. Black Tartarian will splat, and it cracks really easy. So it doesn't ship well. That's the point. It doesn't pick and ship as well. But it's a better cherry. And so in your home orchard, really, everybody wants to plant Bing because this is what they know. But it's not the best cherry. There's a whole lot of other delicious sweet cherries out there for one reason or another that are actually superior. They are superior, okay, but they're not as well known because they're not the commercials. Plus, when you go into a market and you see sweet cherries for sale, if they label it as Bing, it should be Bing. It should be. Otherwise, they're pulling your leg. But a lot of times it just says sweet cherries or sweet black cherries or whatever, Well, that means they're not Bing. You're buying them because you can't grow a Bing on its own. You have to have cross-pollination in order to get the Bing to produce properly. So can all the cherries in the marketplace be Bing? No. Somebody has to be Black Tartarian or Lampert or Van or some other cherry that's interfertile with the Bing. And do they throw all those cherries out? No, you're eating them too. They're in the mix, okay? So a lot of times we're talking about named varieties of things. We don't even know that we're not eating the named varieties half the time. Dragon fruit, you go back 30 years, about the only place this fruit was really known was in the wilds in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, places where these cacti grew in the rainforest. There it was picked for thousands of years out of nature. It's been eaten for a long time by humans in the region. But nobody started to farm it, and nobody really started to develop new cultivars of that plant until, go back 30 years or so. Argue with me, I don't know the exact date, but it wasn't long ago. And the Vietnamese and the Thai began to work with dragon fruit, and then kind of parallel in Israel, working with the sweeter types, the Solanacereus group. They started working with dragon fruit. Well, the Israelis supply the European market, so we generally don't get much of their stuff in the U.S., although Desert King got here because of them. Even yet, what I've seen of like Thai dragon fruit, I don't see any serious heavy hybridizing programs. What I see is selecting. That they're planting out seedlings and they're evaluating and they say, we like this one, it's got good color, good size, and so on. And so they select from that and then they clone from the plant. But the plants, at least in Asia, do not appear to be heavily hybridized. Now you go to Israel, it's another story. The Israelis have been crossing their dragon fruit with everything under the sun, and so they're working with doing hybridization. And so, give us another few decades and dragon fruit seed will begin to get so scrambled up that it probably won't breed true to type. But for the meantime, most varieties are incredibly true. In tropical fruits, there's variation, but the variation is limited. And in my opinion, the variation is highly desirable. One of the temperate fruits that is comparable to the tropical group, and that's the pawpaw. Asaminah triloba. All pawpaw trees I have ever grown have always been from seed. Now, in the very far end of things, before before I moved here to Hawaii, I did have availability of grafted pawpaw trees in the nursery, several varieties that I could sell. But you go back, 30, 40 years ago, I guess it'd probably be closer to 50 years ago, I started planting pawpaw. You could buy seedling trees from a few nurseries in the U.S. There were some name varieties, too. But boy, they were hard to get. Almost nobody grafted them and propagated them. Well, when I started growing the trees, I gathered my seeds from quality sources. I went to people who were out there who were breeding pawpaws and got a hold of seeds they were using that we knew were of the best types. I planted from those seeds, and the trees that I got from them, they varied a little bit, but not enough to worry about, to tell you the truth. There was some variation, though, both in size, shape, fruit quality, and also in fertility. A lot of pawpaws are almost self-sterile or only partially self-fertile. I did end up with some progeny from my collection that were self-fertile trees that would stand alone. Now, that was really a jump forward. And so here we've got a situation where planting the seeds from the pawpaws produce trees that I couldn't have bought in the marketplace, because self-fertile pawpaw trees are a hard thing to find. Anyway, I had self-fertile trees with really, really high-quality fruit that were just to die for, and they were grown from seed. And here it's a situation where the pawpaw, like the tropical fruits, it hadn't been fudged with much. It's still pretty much a forest tree. Seeds taken from a good pawpaw and planted are going to produce a very high percentage of excellent quality pawpaw trees. So your beauty here is numbers, price. availability. This is what it's all about. Seeds cheap. Sometimes it's almost free. Okay. Seeds cheap. Grafted trees are expensive as all get out. They can be impossible or nearly impossible to locate. And so you have availability factor, all right? You have the adaptability factor. When you take 100 seeds and you plant them out, and you find that 80% of them drop dead in cold weather or the rain or whatever the environmental factor is, if there's survivors, those survivors may have what it takes to be able to create a line that will actually grow on your site. This is how you expand the range. You don't expand the range on fruit trees ordinarily with known grafted cultivars. You can when a cultivar has been known to grow in an area, or if you're willing to experiment with it. It's very possible that I had the first macadamia nut tree that had ever been successfully grown in the town of Fremont. There were none that I know of. None of the arborists I know of in that area knew of any trees that were there. The closest tree to where I lived was in Berkeley on the university's grounds, and it was cut down for the sports stadium at about 60 years old. There was nothing to compare to, and there were no seeds in the area, and so I purchased a grafted Beaumont, because it was known to be hardy for California. I put it in. It was a winner. I grew from it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of seedlings that came down from the tree. Now, Beaumont's a hybrid, and so the seedlings had variability, but the one thing they all had in common is they all survived the winter in Northern California. You know, we got this adaptability issue, availability issue. The old gardener once told Bill, you plant one for the bugs, one for the weather, and one for the gardener. That makes 3. That's the best way to go, even if it's a tomato plant. By growing tropical trees from seed, you're not necessarily going to end up with exactly the same tree, but most often you're going to end up with a tree that's of acceptable quality, and it's pretty high percentage will end up being better than the tree you got the seed from. That's been my experience. Alrighty, aloha, grow more trees from seed, hang loose.